So say that again.
We know of African Americans who don't want to take a DNA test because they can't handle it and don't want to see a European percentage because they know what that represents.
Right.
What advice would you give them? How would you talk that person around?
Well, first off, I would first tell them that it may not represent what they think it represents. That's number one. Because no matter how much African Americans want to say that every enslaved woman was raped, they may not have been raped. I know it's hard to take in. I know that's a hard thought process, but
hey,
what makes you, I guess my thing with this is, what makes you think that a person, a Black and a white person, can fall in love now but couldn't fall in love then? Why? Why is it different? Because they were enslaved? If I'm looking at you and I find you attractive before you start doing all that crazy stuff to me, then I'm finding you attractive. That doesn't stop. That's how I look at it. I'm logically thinking. That's my thought process. Now I may get attacked when it goes on YouTube.
No, because actually, I'll do two quick examples. So Venus Jossie, Northampton County, North Carolina, her enslaver, who is the father of her children, he's writing her love letters from the Civil War battlefield. I mean, proper love letters. Now, what she felt, we don't know, because she was illiterate. She didn't respond. She didn't write her feelings back to him. We only have that one-sided conversation, but he was writing her full-on love letters from the Civil War battlefield. She was enslaved. I guess you'd call her a concubine. Well, she was like his common law wife because he never married. You've got another one in Virginia, the most notorious colonial era divorce Rome. His family forced him to marry a white socialite. He didn't want to marry her. He was already in love with an enslaved woman called Sylvie, and he's from Ohio. Well, his family spat the dummy. They threw the toys out of the pram. To say that they said, "Oh hell no," was an understatement. Made him get married. It was a disaster. He made his white socialite wife work in the fields like a slave, made Sylvie the mistress of the household, giving his wife orders. Well, his wife wasn't having any of it. He got abusive with her, which don't condone. And to cut a long story short, she sued him. His wife sued him for divorce. Not only did she win, Virginia forbade Newman from ever marrying again. They wanted to make him an example. But he loved who he loved. And if it wasn't for the interference of his family, could have. But that's not how it ended. So as Donnie was saying, we can't always take the trust. I have evidence of rape. Never pleasant or easy to read, especially when it's being written about in a dry history book. But you can't always assume that that's the case.
Right.
And sometimes it's just going to be a question mark. My Sheffy ancestor Elsie, she had 5 children by the brother of her enslaver. When you start having 5 or 6 kids with the same person, is that going to be rape every? I don't know. I don't know what the relationship was, but I find it hard to believe that that's going to happen 5 or 6 times. Sally Hemings, Thomas Jefferson. We don't have her side of the story. I don't think he ever wrote about how he felt about Sally. That's another question. That's another question mark. But I wouldn't let that put, if you want to reclaim your family history, DNA is basically, especially when it's an enslaved family, DNA is going to have to come into it sooner or later, one way or another.
This is where you can start deciphering whether or not once you've done, in our opinion, once you start doing your, taking those particular steps, you can start deciphering on whether or not they took their name because they had to, or they took their name because they wanted to. And then another thing that people need to realize is that after the Civil War ended, they had a choice. They were told you can keep this name or you can choose another name. So sometimes you may not even come to the position of finding out why they have that last name. You know, it was an entire choice for that. Because they could say, oh, yeah, well, I want to be Mitchell. And Mitchell has nothing to do with them. And you're looking around for a Mitchell slave family like my seniors. Why are they seniors? Where did it come from? There is not one white enslaving senior family in the Edgefield area. Not one. But I've seen the last name Senior in Europe. I've seen a lot of UK census records with that last name. But why does my family have that last name? I have no clue.
Presidential surnames like Washington, Jefferson, and Jackson are some of the most common family names amongst Black Americans. Why is that? Many Black Americans get their last names from the families that enslaved their ancestors, and despite many of the early presidents owning slaves, it wouldn't account for the overrepresentation of Black Americans in presidential surnames. Freed slaves often only had a first name and were free to choose their last name. The names of the founding fathers represented liberty and prestige, and thus became popular among a group of people proud of their new freedom.
And I think, you know, people think that those who were back then were dumb, and they were way smarter than a lot of us are today. Way smarter.
And they knew more about where they came from than what historians and people want to give them credit for. So we know that just talking about Edgefield and for a minute, that's not the case with all of our families. Again, most of it looks as though they knew who they descended from. So they were taking names that were meaningful to them, that they felt that they had a right to take because of their ancestry.
So she continues to keep the last name Brooks. Sometimes that's a clue that you know that they're actually belonging to that family that they are enslaved by. Not just holding on to the name because they have to, but holding on to the name because it's theirs. That is their name. That's who she comes from. If it's popping up in your line, then there's a possibility that you are connected to that enslaver, and they could have kept that name because they were related to him and they already knew it.
And it's something that I would really, really like to research. And in particular, did this come from Black families themselves? Were they ever asked? Or did this come from perhaps white people who were uncomfortable about why so many enslaved families shared the same names as white families? So obviously our surnames had to come from somewhere. And what I can say from my own direct ancestry is my ancestors, and I did a mental inventory before the show, but my ancestors took the names that were biologically theirs to take. So no, they were not African names, they are not African surnames, but that's because all of my enslaved lines end with a Black woman, mostly a Black woman and a white enslaver. Every once in a blue moon, it's a white woman who's having children either with a free man of color or an enslaved man, but they're not married. So the children took her surname. But even then, they're still taking names that are biologically theirs to take. Now, where it's going to get tricky for people is where someone who was enslaved detested their enslaving family so much that they didn't use that name. I've got a case of two Abernathy's in Halifax, North Carolina, who knew exactly who their father was. Sorry, they didn't use Abernathy. They actually used the Rohn, R-H-O-N-E surname, but they were biologically Abernathy's. They hated him so much, they refused to take the name. Now, why they chose Rohn is anyone's guess. There is not a Rohn family in that county, but that's the name that they took for today. And they were saying, well, slaves had to take the surname of their enslaver. That's not necessarily true. I do have an example. So we have James Henry Hammond, governor of South Carolina, from Edgefield, who insisted that his enslaved people they had to take the Hammond surname. Well, come 1870, when we see the vast majority of his enslaved people, 95% of them dropped Hammond. So clearly they were like, no, we're not Hammonds. We're not Hammonds at all. We know who our ancestors were. So all of a sudden you start seeing other names besides Hammond. So I can agree to that to a point, but even then, I mean, I've done deep research in the colonial period with enslaved people, and there are surnames. It doesn't happen particularly often, but you do see enslaved people mentioned in an estate inventory or will with the last name. That's how I got some spectacular leads on my enslaved Crump family in Virginia. They're there with their surnames. Now, whether or not they were biologically Crumped, I don't know. But again, seeing an enslaved person with a surname in an inventory or will in the slavery period, I'm not going to say it's an everyday thing, but it's not necessarily an uncommon thing either. One interesting story that I did hear from a cousin, this is really funny. So again, newly freed enslaved person in Virginia, out in the fields, working his farm. And I believe it's a Union armed officer comes riding up, and he just asks the man his name. So according to my cousin, the guy kind of thought for a second, and he knew who his father was. His father was his enslaver, but he absolutely hated his father. So because he was actually standing in an onion field, he said, "Onion, my name is John Onion." And that's how that family got that